Hello, Justin. It's Monday, March 9th. Now, before I get into the main point of this video, I have to introduce you to somebody. Now, it's somebody that you already know very well, so it's not a new introduction, but it's an introduction to an old friend. Look! It's Chip Clip! Oh, Chip Clip. Always leaving me at the bar. It's very upsetting. And I'm going to leave Chip Clip on my shoulder for the entire video. He fell off. I now acknowledge that that was a poor decision on my part. That's a good place for him. That's a good place for him. Alright, so now that that's out of the way, let's talk about what I actually wanted to talk about in this video. And that is, of course, as the title says, the Saga of Peter. Now here's the thing about me. I have played a variety of Shakespearean characters. But in all honesty, it's not necessarily a variety because I have a tendency to basically just play the same character. And it's mostly just because of how I'm cast. It's not that I choose to play the same character necessarily, it's that I seem to keep getting cast into very similar characters. So because this is the case, I made the decision to create a story where all of these characters are in fact one and the same, because I'm a dork with too much time on my hands. The only exception to this rule is Lucio from Measure for Measure, because he is just so different from anything that I've ever played that I can't make him be the same person. Also, technically, Rosencrantz is an exception, because I ended up actually playing Peter in that particular production of Hamlet, although, if I hadn't, I probably could have made Rosencrantz fit into the same story. So, I could have made it work either way, but Rosencrantz isn't in this case. I ramble a lot. Why does that? Why? So, without further ado, here is the Saga of Peter. We start our story in New York City, although the prologue still says Verona, so that's weird. We meet the main character of our story, Peter. Peter works for the Capulet household and isn't even remotely happy about it, mostly because they treat him like crap. His only friend and confidant is Juliet, the sole heir to the Capulet household. After a fling with the heir of Montague, Capulet's rival family, ends in Juliet's death, Peter decides no longer to stay with the Capulet household since Juliet was the only thing that made it bearable. So he packs his bag and leaves. Now, it's at this point that there are two differing timelines. The next step, no matter what, is Denmark, so the question is, does he go to Denmark right away, or does he wait a little bit? I am now going to explore both of these timelines briefly. In the right away timeline, Peter moves to Denmark to go as far away from New York City as possible. He soon finds employment with the King of Denmark, King Claudius. Now, there were whispers about the former king and how he died and how it may or may not have been Claudius's fault, but Peter tends to not want to listen to gossip. There's also the old king's son, Hamlet, who really was just strange. Shortly after his arrival, Peter was asked to be a pallbearer for Ophelia's funeral, Ophelia being the daughter of the former chief counselor of the king. I say former because he's dead. Peter soon realized that he went from one place where there was a lot of death to another place where there was a lot of death. And then there was a sword fight between Hamlet and Laertes, Ophelia's brother, and there was something about poisoned swords and poisoned drinks, and the end result was that basically everybody died. The wait timeline is pretty much the same with a few minor differences. First of all, Peter decides to travel the world a bit before he goes to Denmark. He also makes the decision to change his name to distance himself from New York City and gives himself the name of Osric. He then moves to Denmark, becomes employed by King Claudius, hears the whisper, ignores it, etc., etc. Although with this timeline he does have a little more interaction with Hamlet, but whichever timeline you happen to be in, he's still very strange. And in this timeline he was actually in charge of the swords and oversaw the match. He was unaware that the swords were poisoned, but he still oversaw the match. It didn't end well. Whichever timeline we go with, the end result is that Peter doesn't really want to be in Denmark anymore because, let's face it, it's worse than New York City in the terms of just how much death he is surrounded by. So he packs his bag once more and leaves. This time he moves to France, to the court of Duke Senior, and picks up the name of Amans. It was also around this time that he began dabbling in music, specifically vocal, and found that he actually enjoyed it a great deal. Soon after he became a part of Duke Senior's court, Duke Senior was overthrown by his younger brother Duke Frederick, and was banished to the Forest of Arden. Peter decided to travel with Duke Senior to the Forest of Arden because, quite frankly, he had had enough of usurping kings to last him a lifetime. And honestly, it wasn't that bad a time. Except for Jacques. Jacques made everything melancholy, even if it wasn't. He even did that to Peter's singing, and Peter's singing was cheerful, thank you very much. And then there was the whole confusion with the Duke's daughter Rosalind, who was disguised as a man and yet was very clearly a woman, and yet no one seemed to notice. By the end of this particular escapade, Rosalind was married, and Rosalind's cousin was married, and several other people were married, and Duke Sr. ended up back on the throne, but by the time this was all over, Peter decided that this just wasn't for him. So, once again, he packed up his bags and left. This time he moved to the town of Ephesus in Greece, and became the jailer. He worked for the Duke, which was pleasant enough, but then came the day of the twins. You see, Peter was fairly cynical by this time, based on everything that had happened so far, and his time in Ephesus did nothing to change that. On the day in question, Peter was asked by the local goldsmith, who looked suspiciously like the mayor of New York City, to arrest a fellow by the name of Antipholus because he owed him money and refused to pay. Antipholus insisted that he never got the trinket that he supposedly had to pay for, even though he ordered it. But Peter arrested him, and he sent his servant to his wife to get money for his bail. But then his servant, a fellow by the name of Dromio, returns with something completely different, with no recollection that he was supposed to get money, and then somehow they were able to pay in two places at once, and then it turns out that we were dealing with twins. And not just one set of twins, two sets of twins, with the same name. The parents must not have been very creative. Having met the father, Peter can attest to that. All this means that Peter was running around town on a wild goose chase, and by the end, everyone was laughing about it. Honestly, he felt like he was just in a farce, and he didn't appreciate it at all. Also, he found himself mentoring someone who reminded him of Juliet, and he didn't really understand why. Needless to say, by the end of this debacle, Peter was done. So, once again, Peter packed up his bags and left. This time he moved to the town of Athens and decided to pick up his old name Peter, but add the last name of Quince. He takes up carpentry, and as a side venture, decides to build up an acting troupe. His acting troupe soon gets big enough that he is asked to perform something at the Duke's wedding. Which is all well and good, except he has to work with Nick Bottom, a weaver who thinks he's all that. Who also looks like the mayor of New York City. Go figure. Anyway, he tries to work past that, ends up getting scared in the woods. Nick Bottom turns into an ass, the donkey variety, he was already the other one. Ends up eventually turning back to his old self, they perform the play, and Nick Bottom took all the credit, as he is wont to do. And that, at the moment, is where our story ends. Also, he was a bartender for Duke Orsino for a little bit, but he doesn't like to talk about that. There it is, the Saga of Peter. And I know this is going to be a super long video, but you know, I haven't made a short video yet, so why start now? Justin, I will see you on Friday.